The night was heavy with glitter and lies. In the heart of Manhattan, the Grand Regent Hotel glowed like a palace of glass and gold. Limousines lined the entrance, spilling out men in black tuxedos and women shimmering in sequined gowns. Cameras flashed in a frenzy, catching every laugh, every glance, every whispered rumor. Tonight was the charity ball of the year, a playground for the city's elite where fortunes were flaunted and reputations were sharpened like knives. And at the center of it all was Adrian Lawson. He walked into the ballroom with the confidence of a man who thought the world was his to command. His smile was practiced, a perfect curve that had closed deals worth millions. But what drew the eyes of every guest wasn't his charm or his suit tailored in Italy. It was the woman hanging on his arm, Sienna Cruz, 25, radiant in a ruby-red gown that clung to her every curve, her laughter slicing through the polite hum of the ballroom. She wasn't his wife. Everyone knew that. She was his mistress, the worst-kept secret in New York high society. Adrian paraded her proudly, as though daring anyone to question him. And yet, a floor above this spectacle, in a quiet hotel suite, another woman sat alone. Emma Lawson pressed a trembling hand against her swollen belly. 6 months pregnant, her reflection in the mirror was a mixture of exhaustion and grace. Her eyes, once full of youthful dreams, were now shadowed by nights of tears. She had once believed that Adrian was her safe place, her partner, her forever. But tonight, as she sat in silence, the muffled echoes of his laughter rising from the ballroom below, she knew the truth was different. This wasn't the first time he had betrayed her. She had endured whispers, excuses, and lipstick stains that weren't hers. She had lived in the shadow of his arrogance, telling herself she could endure for the sake of their unborn child. But each betrayal chipped away at her soul. Tonight, that quiet suffering was turning into fire. Because Emma knew something no one else in the ballroom knew. She knew Adrian's charm wasn't just covering infidelity, it was covering crime. She had seen the documents hidden in his study, contracts laced with false numbers, offshore accounts that reeked of fraud, transfers disguised as business deals. For weeks, she had battled herself. Should she stay silent, play the dutiful wife, and protect the illusion of their family? Or should she act, knowing that exposing him would destroy everything? Her hand tightened over her belly. The tiny kick from inside reminded her of the life depending on her. She could no longer afford silence. Downstairs, Adrian raised a glass of champagne, his arm possessively wrapped around Sienna's waist. Cameras flashed. Investors clapped him on the back. "To the future," he declared. The crowd cheered. Sienna's smile was triumphant, her hand brushing his chest as though she already wore his crown. But fate was already moving. The clock struck midnight, and in the shadows outside the hotel, unmarked police cars rolled to a stop. Doors opened. Men in dark suits stepped out, their badges glinting under the streetlights. They moved with precision, trained eyes fixed on the glittering entrance of the Grand Regent. The ballroom, oblivious, continued to buzz with shallow laughter and false promises. Upstairs, Emma rose from her chair. Her heart pounded, not from fear but from clarity. She had already made the call. She had given the evidence. She had chosen dignity over humiliation, truth over silence. Tonight, Adrian Lawson's empire would fall. She slipped on her coat, every movement deliberate, steady. She would not be the weeping wife clinging to the ashes of betrayal. She would be the woman who walked away before the fire consumed her. At that same moment, the doors of the ballroom swung open. The music faltered. The air shifted. Guests turned, their whispers dying in their throats as they saw the police enter. Their boots clicked sharply against the marble floor, echoing like a drumbeat of doom. Adrian's smirk faltered for the first time that evening. He straightened his shoulders, trying to mask the sudden pallor of his face. Sienna clutched his arm tighter, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Adrian Lawson," one of the officers announced, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." Gasps erupted. Cameras that had once glorified him now captured his disgrace. Investors recoiled. Sienna's painted smile collapsed into panic. Adrian tried to protest, his voice rising in desperation. "This is a mistake. Do you know who I am?" But the officers had no interest in his bravado. They pulled his arms behind his back, the metallic click of handcuffs echoing louder than the chandeliers above. And while the ballroom drowned in shock, Emma walked quietly through a side corridor, her suitcase already packed. Outside, waiting for her, was a sleek private jet. Beside it stood Gabriel Stone, a man whose presence was calm, steady, and certain. He had been her friend once, years ago, back when life was simple and dreams were untouched by betrayal. And now, he was here again, offering not rescue but choice. Emma looked at him, then at the jet behind him. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe. Because as Adrian Lawson was dragged through the crowd, his empire crumbling, Emma Lawson was boarding her own escape. Not as a victim, but as a woman who had chosen her dignity over his lies. And the world was about to see the difference. Because tonight, the mistress was left trembling in a ruined ballroom, while the pregnant wife boarded a jet toward freedom. Emma Lawson was not born into wealth. She grew up in a small town upstate where the nights smelled of pine trees and summers hummed with crickets. Her father was a school teacher, her mother a nurse. They didn't have much, but they gave her a foundation of love and integrity. Emma was the girl who painted sunsets on the old barn wall, the girl who dreamed of designing homes that felt like safe harbors. She studied architecture with relentless passion, believing she could shape spaces where people would feel whole and protected. At university, she was brilliant, driven, admired. Professors praised her vision. Classmates sought her out for group projects. Yet despite her talent, she was humble, working nights at a coffee shop to afford rent. That's where she first met Adrian. He had swaggered in one evening, all charm and polished shoes, a business student with a quick smile. He noticed her sketchbook, pages filled with blueprints and half-finished facades. "You're building the future," he'd said, sliding his number across the counter with a grin. Emma had laughed, flustered, and tucked the paper into her pocket. Their love story unfolded like a whirlwind. Adrian courted her with grand gestures, flowers delivered to her dorm, surprise dinners after late shifts, promises whispered under starry skies. For a girl who had never been chased with such intensity, it felt like a fairy tale. He made her feel seen, valued, cherished. By the time they graduated, he was already climbing the corporate ladder in finance, and she was offered a coveted position at a boutique architecture firm in New York. She hesitated, torn between ambition and the vision of a life with Adrian. He had leaned in, kissed her hand, and said, "Emma, you don't need to burn yourself out working for someone else. I'll provide for us. You can design when you want. Focus on us, on our family." It was intoxicating. The idea of being chosen, protected. Against her professor's warnings, she turned down the job and followed Adrian into the city, building a life centered around his rising star. For a while, it was beautiful. Their wedding was intimate but elegant, held in a candlelit chapel. Adrian looked at her like she was his whole world. He spoke of children, of building a legacy together. Emma believed she had made the right choice. She decorated their modest apartment with thrifted furniture she transformed into art. She filled their home with warmth, laughter, and quiet devotion. But slowly, the cracks began to appear. Adrian's charm shifted into arrogance. He stayed late at the office, brushed off her questions with casual lies. When she found receipts from expensive restaurants, he told her they were business dinners. When perfume lingered on his suit, he claimed it was from colleagues leaning in for handshakes. At first, she believed him. Love has a way of blinding even the wisest heart. Then came the isolation. He discouraged her from going back to work, reminding her she didn't need to burden herself. When she tried to freelance, he mocked her small paychecks, comparing them to his growing bonuses. She began to shrink inside her own marriage, trading blueprints for grocery lists, lectures for laundry. The day she discovered she was pregnant, she thought everything would change. She had walked into the living room with trembling hands, holding the positive test. Adrian's face had lit up with what looked like joy. He lifted her into his arms, spinning her around. For one brief, shining moment, Emma believed the man she married was back. But reality arrived quickly. His late nights became later. His temper grew shorter. When she complained about nausea or exhaustion, he snapped. Plenty of women do this without whining. He reminded her constantly of the costs piling up, as though the baby were an inconvenience rather than a blessing. The worst part was not his cruelty. It was his indifference. Emma would lie awake at night, her hand over her belly, whispering lullabies to the child who had yet to arrive. She told herself she was strong enough to endure, that love was sacrifice, that keeping the family intact was worth any humiliation. But deep inside, something was cracking. The final blow came one icy winter morning. Emma had gone to meet Adrian for lunch at his office, a small surprise to brighten his day. She carried a homemade meal in her hands, hope in her heart. But when she opened the door without knocking, what she saw seared into her memory forever. Sienna Cruz, perched on Emma's chair, wearing Emma's husband's jacket, laughing in a way that sliced like glass. Adrian didn't even look guilty. He stood there, smug, as though daring Emma to challenge him. "It's not what you think," he had said, his voice dripping with condescension. But Emma knew. She knew this wasn't the first time. It had been happening for months, maybe years. She stared at him, her body trembling, one hand instinctively cradling her belly. She wanted to scream, to rage, to collapse. Instead, she walked out silently, her tears falling onto the snow. That night, in the quiet of their penthouse, she made herself a promise. She would not beg, she would not crumble, she would not let her child inherit a legacy of betrayal. Emma began to pay attention. She searched his files, his emails, his ledgers, and what she found was darker than infidelity. It was crime, fraud, money laundering, offshore accounts, documents that could send him to prison for years. For days, she battled her conscience. Turning him in would mean destroying the father of her child, but keeping silent would mean allowing corruption to define her family's name. The weight of that choice nearly broke her. Until one night, as she felt her baby's kick against her palm, she realized the child deserved a future built on truth, not lies. And in that moment, Emma stopped being the weak, silenced wife. She became something stronger. She picked up the phone, she made the call, and nothing, from that moment on, would ever be the same. Because the woman who had once given up her dreams for love had now chosen dignity over betrayal, and her choice would shatter Adrian's world. The Grand Regent Hotel sparkled like a crown jewel against the Manhattan skyline. Its towering glass facade shimmered with light, reflecting the city that never slept. Inside, the ballroom was transformed into a spectacle of wealth and vanity. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, scattering light over marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Every corner dripped with extravagance. Champagne fountains, towering floral arrangements of imported orchids, and a string quartet playing softly against the chatter of the rich and powerful. It was the night of the annual Winter Charity Gala, a cornerstone event where the city's elite came to parade their fortunes under the guise of philanthropy. Politicians mingled with CEOs, actors brushed shoulders with hedge fund managers, and the air was thick with perfume, ambition, and secrets. For many, this was the highlight of the year, a stage to show off gowns worth small fortunes, to pledge donations that doubled as business investments, to whisper alliances over caviar and champagne. And at the heart of it all stood Adrian Lawson. He was magnetic in a black tuxedo cut to perfection, his dark hair slicked back, his smile sharp enough to disarm. Guests swarmed him, investors clapping his back, women laughing at his every word. He thrived in this world, a man who knew exactly how to command attention, how to turn every room into his kingdom. But it wasn't his wealth or wit that stirred whispers tonight. It was the woman at his side, Sienna Cruz. Her ruby gown shimmered like fire under the chandelier's glow. Every movement revealed curves sculpted to perfection, her lips painted a daring red to match. She clung to Adrian's arm as though she had already claimed him. Her laughter was loud, throaty, almost mocking in a room of polite giggles. To the other women, she was an insult. To the men, she was temptation. And to Emma Lawson, watching from afar, she was betrayal personified. Because Emma was there too. She hadn't wanted to come. Every fiber of her being screamed to stay home, to avoid the spectacle. But part of her knew this was the stage where the truth needed to be seen. If Adrian believed he could humiliate her in private, parade Sienna in public, and still hold his empire intact, he was mistaken. Emma arrived quietly, her gown modest compared to the glittering excess around her. She didn't come to compete in beauty or wealth. She came with resolve. She kept to the edges of the room, her hand resting protectively over her belly. Conversations hushed when she passed, eyes flicking between her and the spectacle of Adrian and Sienna across the ballroom. Some faces showed pity, others curiosity, a few cruel amusement. Emma bore it all with a quiet dignity, her back straight, her expression calm. Inside, her heart was a storm. Adrian spotted her once. Their eyes locked across the room. For a flicker of a second, his smile faltered. Then he tightened his grip on Sienna's waist and laughed louder, as if to erase the sight of his wife from his mind. "Mr. Lawson," an investor gushed, raising a glass, "to another year of brilliance. You make the rest of us look lazy." Adrian smirked. "To the future," he declared, his voice booming, carrying across the ballroom. Cameras flashed. Sienna leaned in and kissed his cheek, sealing the image of power and scandal in one frame. Guests cheered, pretending not to notice Emma standing alone in the shadows. The hypocrisy of it all made Emma's stomach churn. These people worshipped Adrian, blind to the lies stacked beneath his empire. But soon, she thought, their worship would curdle into shock. She had made sure of it. Meanwhile, Sienna basked in her stolen spotlight. She whispered into Adrian's ear, her eyes scanning the room to make sure Emma saw every touch, every smile. She wanted Emma humiliated, broken. What she didn't know was that her triumph would soon collapse. As the orchestra swelled into a waltz, couples flooded the dance floor. Adrian led Sienna out, their bodies pressed close, spinning under the chandeliers. Murmurs rippled. Even in a city numb to scandal, this was bold, brazen, almost cruel. Cameras clicked furiously, and from the shadows, Emma stood motionless, watching, each click of the camera like a dagger. But she wasn't just watching. She was waiting. Across town, unmarked police vehicles rolled closer to the hotel. Officers checked their files, the warrants signed with Emma's evidence. Their radios crackled softly. They had been waiting weeks for this moment, gathering proof, building the case. Tonight, the facade would break. Back in the ballroom, the atmosphere grew heady with champagne and speculation. A senator leaned toward a tech CEO, whispering, "Do you think his wife knows?" They both glanced at Emma, standing dignified and alone, then quickly looked away, guilty at being caught. Emma's oldest friend from college, now married to a banker, approached her quietly. "Emma, you don't have to stay. Everyone's talking. This is cruel." Emma offered a faint smile. "Sometimes you have to walk through the fire," she whispered, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. Her friend touched her arm, then melted back into the crowd. Emma was alone again. Alone, but not powerless. As midnight neared, Adrian's voice once again rose above the music. He stood with Sienna by his side, addressing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. This city is built on vision, on ambition, on the courage to seize opportunity. That's what I've always lived by, and that's what I'll continue to do." The crowd erupted in applause, unaware of how close his empire was to collapse. Cameras captured his every word, broadcasting the speech across the society pages, freezing him in a moment of glory that would soon turn to infamy. And Emma, standing near the back, exhaled slowly. Her decision was already set in motion. By the time the music swelled again, the doors of the ballroom would open. Not for more guests, but for justice. Because tonight wasn't just another gala. Tonight was the stage where arrogance would meet consequence, and where a pregnant wife would reclaim her dignity in front of the world. If arrogance had a face, it was Sienna Cruz. She was only 25, but she carried herself like a queen who had already conquered her kingdom. Her red gown shimmered like fire as she strolled across the ballroom on Adrian's arm. Every step was deliberate, every glance calculated. She wanted the entire room to know Adrian Lawson belonged to her now, and she especially wanted Emma to see it. From the corner of the ballroom, Emma stood quietly, her hand resting on her belly. Sienna's eyes locked onto her like a predator spotting its prey. A slow smile curled across her lips, not of warmth, but of triumph. She leaned closer to Adrian, pressing a kiss dangerously near his mouth, her voice loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "You really should have divorced her by now," she purred. "She doesn't fit in this world." Emma caught the words. She didn't flinch. But inside, her chest burned. Adrian smirked, pretending to hush Sienna, but he didn't disagree. That silence, that smugness, was worse than any insult. Sienna loved the power she held. Not long ago, she had been a nobody, an ambitious assistant barely noticed in the office. But Adrian had spotted her, praised her ambition, drawn her into his circle. He had given her designer clothes, access to his penthouse, and a seat at tables she could never have imagined. And in return, she gave him youth, beauty, and blind adoration. It wasn't love, it was conquest. For both of them. "Look at her dress," Sienna whispered loudly to a group of women as Emma passed by. Her laugh rang out, sharp and cruel. 3 seasons old at least. Doesn't she know where she is? This is the Grand Regent, not a thrift shop. A ripple of uneasy laughter followed. A few women looked away, ashamed. Others leaned in, eager for the gossip. Emma felt every word like a lash across her skin, but she held her head high, refusing to give Sienna the satisfaction of a reaction. Adrian, meanwhile, basked in Sienna's performance. His arm stayed firmly around her waist, his smile never wavering. He loved the drama, the attention, the whispers it created. To him, Emma was old news, something he tolerated for appearances, nothing more. But Sienna underestimated Emma. She thought humiliation was enough to break her. She thought flaunting her conquest would crush the wife she called pathetic. What she didn't know was that Emma had already turned the game on its head. Across the ballroom, whispers grew. Some guests pitied Emma, others despised Adrian's shamelessness, but all eyes were on the triangle. And Sienna, drunk on attention, leaned deeper into her cruelty. "Sweetheart," she said loudly, her hand stroking Adrian's chest, "you promised me you'd replace her. When will you finally give me what I deserve?" Emma's throat tightened. The baby kicked, as though sensing her turmoil. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and reminded herself, just a little longer. Because the real spectacle hadn't even begun. But in her arrogance, Sienna couldn't stop. She sought Emma out deliberately, drifting across the room until they were only a few feet apart. Her perfume hit first, sharp, expensive, suffocating. Then came her voice, dripping with mock sweetness. "Emma," she said, feigning surprise, "I didn't expect to see you here. Brave of you to show up, given, well, you know." Emma's gaze was steady. "Given what?" Sienna's smile widened. "That you've already lost." The words hung heavy between them, cruel and cutting. Guests nearby pretended not to listen, but their ears strained for every syllable. Emma wanted to scream, to tear that smug look off her face, but she forced her voice to remain calm. "Sometimes," Emma said softly, "the one who laughs first doesn't laugh last." For a moment, Sienna's confidence faltered. Her brow furrowed, just briefly. But then she tossed her hair, dismissing the comment with a scoff. "We'll see." She turned back to Adrian, clutching his arm tighter, her laughter echoing as they walked away. But that tiny flicker of doubt, that tremor she tried to mask, was the beginning of her unraveling. Because what Sienna didn't know was that Emma had already delivered evidence to the authorities. She didn't know that the man she clung to was about to be ripped from her arms in front of everyone. And when that moment came, Sienna would fall with him. For now, though, she continued her performance. She posed for photographs with Adrian, deliberately positioning herself so Emma was visible in the background. She whispered barbs to anyone who would listen, painting Emma as weak, outdated, irrelevant. Every cruel word was fuel for her ego. But arrogance blinds. While Sienna relished in temporary victory, she failed to notice the shift in the room. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Investors whispered about Adrian's risky ventures. Politicians muttered about rumors of financial misconduct. The cracks were already visible, and when the doors burst open later that night, they would shatter completely. Emma, meanwhile, withdrew to the edge of the ballroom, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. She knew Sienna's cruelty wasn't strength. It was insecurity disguised as power. And soon, the mistress who mocked her would taste humiliation deeper than any cruel word could deliver. Because Adrian's downfall would not just strip him of wealth and reputation, it would drag Sienna down with him. The same crowd that cheered her tonight would sneer at her tomorrow. The same photographers capturing her gown would capture her shame. Emma whispered to her unborn child, barely audible over the music, "Justice is coming. For both of us." And across the ballroom, Sienna laughed louder, oblivious to the storm already closing in. Because when arrogance burns too bright, it always consumes itself. And Sienna Cruz was about to learn that lesson in front of the entire world. The night was building toward its climax. The ballroom pulsed with energy. Champagne flutes clinked, laughter echoed. The orchestra swelled into a triumphant crescendo. Adrian Lawson stood at the center of it all, his hand wrapped firmly around Sienna's waist, his smile dazzling beneath the glow of the chandeliers. He believed this was his night, his empire, his triumph, his stage. But fate had a different script. Just as the music reached its peak, the grand doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. The sound was sharp, commanding, louder than the orchestra itself. The strings faltered, the pianist missed a note, and silence rippled outward like a wave. Heads turned, conversations stopped, the air shifted. A line of men in dark suits entered, their presence heavy, undeniable. Badges gleamed under the golden light. Their expressions were grim, purposeful. They weren't here to sip champagne. Adrian Lawson. The lead officer's voice cut through the silence like a blade. It was calm, steady, final. For the first time that evening, Adrian's smile cracked. His grip on Sienna tightened, his eyes darting toward the officers as though searching for an escape. Around him, the crowd gasped, whispers exploding like wildfire. Cameras that had been capturing glamour now swiveled toward scandal. "You are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy," the officer announced, his words echoing across the marble. Sienna's painted smile collapsed into horror. She pulled at Adrian's arm. "Tell them it's a mistake. Say something." Her voice rose in panic, sharp and shrill, but Adrian's face had turned pale. He tried to gather himself, straightening his shoulders, forcing arrogance back into his tone. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed. "Do you know who I am? Do you know who you're talking to?" The officer's gaze didn't waver. "Yes, and we know exactly what you've done. Place your hands behind your back." Gasps rippled. Phones rose in the air, recording every second. Investors muttered. Politicians exchanged alarmed glances. The orchestra had fallen silent, bows frozen midair. The room, once filled with glittering power, was now suffocating with shame. Adrian hesitated, his pride warring with fear. "I will not." The officers moved swiftly, grabbing his arms, twisting them behind his back. The sharp click of handcuffs reverberated louder than the chandeliers above. The mighty Adrian Lawson, the man who had commanded boardrooms and ballrooms alike, stood shackled, helpless, humiliated. The crowd erupted into whispers. Fraud? Conspiracy? I knew something was off. His poor wife? And then, as though on cue, all eyes turned toward Emma. She stood near the back, still as stone, her hand protectively over her belly. The whispers grew louder. Some pitied her, others admired her calm, but none could look away. To them, she wasn't just a wife betrayed. She was a woman witnessing justice unfold. Adrian saw her too, his eyes locked on hers across the chaos. In that instant, his arrogance faltered completely. He knew she had been the one to tip the scales. "Emma," he choked, his voice desperate, strained. "Tell them, say something. Stop this." But Emma didn't move. She didn't speak. Her silence was louder than any words she could have uttered. Sienna, trembling beside him, pulled at his arm. "Adrian, do something. Fix this. You promised me." "Shut up," he snapped, his mask slipping. The cruelty in his voice cut through her like glass. For the first time, the crowd saw the cracks in their glossy facade. The mistress who had mocked Emma just moments ago now stood exposed, shaking, abandoned in the spotlight. As Adrian was dragged toward the doors, the crowd parted like a tide. Phones flashed, capturing his downfall from every angle. His shouts turned frantic. "This is a setup. I'll be back. You'll regret this." But his words only fed the storm, his dignity unraveling with every step. The officers pushed him forward, their grip firm. Sienna stumbled after him, desperate to cling to the man whose power had defined her. But the crowd closed in, their whispers sharp, merciless. She thought she won. Look at her now, nothing but his accessory. Tears streaked Sienna's flawless makeup. The woman who had strutted in with arrogance now looked small, broken. She reached for Adrian, but he was yanked away, swallowed by the authority she could not fight. And Emma? She didn't move. She didn't gloat. She simply stood tall, her presence steady amidst the chaos. Her silence, her dignity, was the sharpest revenge of all. When the doors slammed shut behind Adrian and the officers, the ballroom exhaled as one. The orchestra lowered their instruments. Guests shifted uneasily, some rushing for the exits, others lingering to savor the scandal. Reporters outside were already buzzing, the story of the year unfolding in real time. Emma turned away, her heart heavy but unburdened. She whispered softly to her unborn child, "It's over. We're free." But the night was not finished, because waiting outside the hotel, away from the chaos, was a sleek private jet. And beside it stood Gabriel Stone, a man whose quiet strength was about to change everything. The mistress had mocked. The husband had betrayed. The crowd had judged. But Emma, the woman they all underestimated, was about to rise from the ashes with more dignity than any of them could fathom. Because the gala wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of her freedom. And the world had just witnessed the first act of Adrienne Lawson's spectacular fall. The ballroom was still buzzing with whispers when Emma slipped quietly out a side door. She moved through the long corridor of the Grand Regent Hotel, the soft carpet swallowing the echo of her steps. Behind her, Adrienne's arrest had detonated like a bomb. Cameras flashed, guests gasped, and Sienna's cries still rang faintly in the distance. But Emma was done being part of their spectacle. She pressed a hand against her swollen belly, guiding herself into the shadows of the empty hallway. The strength she had worn like armor in front of hundreds was beginning to crack. Her chest tightened, her throat burned, and before she reached the exit, her legs gave way. She leaned against the wall, trembling, fighting to hold herself together. For weeks she had carried herself with resolve, preparing for this night. She had told herself she was ready for the storm, that justice would taste like freedom. But now, as the adrenaline drained, the crushing weight of it all came down at once. She slid to the floor, her gown pooling around her like spilled silk. Tears blurred her vision, spilling hot down her cheeks. She pressed both hands over her belly, as though anchoring herself to the tiny life inside. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice cracking. The baby kicked gently as if answering, but her fear was louder. She thought of the headlines that would explode by morning. She thought of the judgmental eyes at the gala, of the whispers branding her the betrayed wife. She thought of her child, destined to grow up with a father in prison and a mother carrying the scars of humiliation. Her sobs echoed in the empty hall. She hated that she still loved him once, hated that the man she sacrificed her dreams for had turned her into a cautionary tale. Her heart ached with betrayal, but also with guilt. Had she done the right thing? Was she selfish to destroy him, even if he deserved it? Her phone buzzed in her clutch, vibrating like a restless insect. She pulled it out with shaking hands. Dozens of messages lit the screen. Calls from reporters, texts from acquaintances, pitying notes from so-called friends. Each notification was a dagger, a reminder that her private pain had become public entertainment. She dropped the phone to the floor and covered her face with her hands. For the first time since she made the call to the police, she felt small again, helpless, powerless, lost. The minutes blurred. The hallway felt endless, cold, merciless. She wanted to vanish, to escape the eyes of the world, to crawl into a place where no one could touch her or her baby. But reality was unforgiving. She couldn't go home. Their penthouse was crawling with reporters by now. She couldn't turn to family. Her parents were gone, her relatives distant. And Adrienne? The man who should have been her protector was now a prisoner, dragged away in handcuffs because of the truth she had unleashed. She pressed her forehead to her knees, sobbing until her chest ached. "I can't do this alone," she whispered. The words spilled out like confession. She was strong enough to bring down a giant, but was she strong enough to raise a child in the aftermath? Her mind twisted with doubts. Would her baby hate her one day for destroying his father? Would people always look at her with pity instead of respect? Would she ever feel whole again? Her tears flowed harder, unstoppable. She clutched her belly, rocking slightly, a mother's instinct colliding with a woman's despair. "Please," she whispered to no one in particular. "Please, just let me find a way to survive this." At that moment, the image of Sienna flashed in her mind, smirking, mocking, draped over Adrienne's arm. Rage flared, momentarily cutting through the sorrow. That woman had stolen her dignity, paraded her humiliation, and laughed at her pain. But now Sienna was alone too, abandoned in a collapsing empire. The thought gave Emma a strange, fragile comfort. Maybe justice wasn't just about Adrienne's downfall. Maybe it was about Sienna's arrogance crumbling into dust. Still, the comfort was fleeting. Emma pushed herself up slowly, wiping her face with the back of her hand, her reflection caught in a gilded mirror at the end of the hallway. She barely recognized the woman staring back. Red-rimmed eyes, trembling lips, a posture bent from sorrow. She had stood tall in the ballroom, but here she looked like the broken wife Sienna wanted her to be. And that realization nearly destroyed her. She whispered to her reflection, "I'm not weak. I won't be weak." But even as she said it, her voice cracked. Her knees wobbled as she forced herself toward the exit. Outside, the winter air hit her face like a slap, icy, biting, sobering. The city lights glittered against the night sky, indifferent to her suffering. Paparazzi lights flickered in the distance, reporters swarming the main entrance. Emma stayed in the shadows, clutching her coat tighter around her belly. For a moment, she thought about disappearing into the night. Just running. But where would she go? She had nowhere safe, no plan beyond this night. She had fought for justice, but she had forgotten to prepare for what came after. The fear consumed her. What if she couldn't rebuild? What if her child grew up in shame? What if she was forever trapped in the label of the cheated wife? Her eyes welled again. Her body shook from the cold and the weight of despair. She sank onto a bench outside the hotel, hidden from the crowd, and let her tears fall freely. She was Emma Lawson, once a dreamer, once a believer, now a woman on the edge of collapse. And yet, as broken as she felt, she didn't know that salvation was already on its way. Because not far from where she sat, at a private terminal on the edge of the city, a man was waiting. A man who had once loved her quietly, who had watched her fall into Adrian's world and never stopped caring. A man named Gabriel Stone. And soon, her despair would meet its answer. Because every collapse has its turning point. And Emma Lawson was about to discover hers. Emma sat shivering on the cold bench outside the Grand Regent Hotel, the city's winter air biting into her skin. The world inside the ballroom had imploded with Adrian's arrest. But out here, her own private implosion was unraveling. Her cheeks were raw from tears, her hands trembling as she clutched her belly. She whispered to her unborn child, "I don't know how we're going to survive this." The street buzzed with chaos, reporters swarming the hotel entrance, guests scurrying into waiting cars, police lights flashing red and blue. But Emma stayed hidden in the shadows, unseen, unnoticed, forgotten. For the first time that night, she felt utterly alone. And then a voice. Calm, steady, unmistakably familiar. Emma. Her head snapped up. Through the blur of her tears, she saw him. Gabriel Stone. He stood a few feet away, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark coat cutting a sharp silhouette against the snow-dusted street. His eyes, deep, steady, unwavering, locked onto hers, carrying something she hadn't felt in months. Safety. Emma blinked, stunned. "Gabriel?" He took a step closer, his expression softening. "It's been a long time." Her heart pounded. Memories rushed back. University days filled with late-night study sessions, laughter over cheap pizza. The way Gabriel had always looked at her as though she were more than the sum of her dreams. He had been her friend, her confidant, maybe even something more if life had turned differently. But then Adrian came, dazzling, ambitious, and she drifted away from Gabriel into a marriage that had promised forever. Now here he was, as though fate had drawn him back exactly when she needed someone most. Emma swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "What are you doing here?" "I heard about the gala," Gabriel said quietly. "I knew tonight would be the night everything came crashing down. And I couldn't let you face it alone." Her eyes widened. "You knew?" He nodded. "I've been watching from a distance, Emma. Not in a way to intrude. Just, I couldn't ignore what Adrian was becoming. I knew he'd destroy himself. I only worried he'd destroy you in the process." Tears welled again, but this time they weren't from despair. They were from the staggering weight of being seen, truly seen after so long. Gabriel knelt in front of her, his voice lowering, gentle but firm. "You don't have to stay here. You don't have to drown in his chaos. I've arranged something for you." Emma frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" He gestured down the street. "There's a car waiting. It'll take you to a private terminal. My jet is fueled and ready. You and your baby deserve to leave this mess behind tonight." Emma stared, stunned. "Your jet?" Gabriel gave a small smile. "I built my life quietly while Adrian built his loudly. I didn't want the spotlight, but I've done well enough to give you a way out, if you'll take it." Her breath caught. For weeks she had felt trapped. No safe home, no family to turn to, no escape from the shadow of Adrian's downfall. And now, here was Gabriel, offering her the one thing she hadn't dared to hope for, freedom. But fear tightened her chest. "Gabriel, I can't. I don't want to be a burden. And this baby," he placed a hand over hers, steady, warm. "Emma, listen to me. That child is a part of you. And anyone who loves you should love that child too. You're not a burden. You never were." Her lips trembled, but it's not yours. Gabriel's eyes didn't waver. It doesn't have to be. What matters is that you and your baby are safe. That's all I care about. For the first time in months, Emma's heart loosened. The crushing weight of shame, betrayal, and loneliness lifted, if only slightly. She searched Gabriel's face, looking for pity, for judgment, but there was none. Only unwavering respect, only care. Her tears spilled again, but these tears felt different. They felt like release. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "Because," Gabriel said softly, "I should have told you years ago. I loved you then, Emma, and I never stopped." Her breath hitched. The world seemed to fall silent around them, the chaos of reporters and flashing lights fading into nothing. All she could hear was the thundering of her own heart and Gabriel's steady voice. "I don't expect anything from you," he continued. "Not now, not ever, but I won't stand by and watch you be broken anymore. Let me help you. Let me give you the chance to start over." Emma's hands shook as she gripped his. The warmth of his touch steadied her. For so long she had believed she was alone, but Gabriel had been there, even from afar, waiting for the moment to catch her when she fell. She exhaled shakily, whispering, "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Gabriel's gaze softened. "You already are. You just don't see it yet. But I do. I always have." The words struck deep, igniting something she thought had died. A spark of hope. Slowly, Emma nodded. "Okay." Gabriel squeezed her hands gently, helping her to her feet. "Then come with me." He led her toward a sleek black car waiting at the curb. As they slipped inside, Emma looked back once at the glittering hotel, the chaos swirling outside its doors. She saw the flashing cameras, the reporters shouting, the guests fleeing the scandal they once craved, and she realized she was leaving all of it behind. The car pulled away, carrying her into the quiet night. Gabriel sat beside her, steady and silent, his presence a shield against the storm. Emma leaned her head back, closing her eyes. For the first time in so long, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. She whispered to her unborn child, "We're going to be okay." And deep down, she began to believe it. Because tonight, Emma Lawson's story had twisted, from despair to possibility, from betrayal to hope, from being abandoned to being chosen. The hum of the private jet was steady, soothing, a lullaby against the chaos Emma had left behind. She sat by the window, the city lights of Manhattan shrinking into a glittering patchwork below. Her hand rested gently on her belly, the faint rhythm of her baby's kicks grounding her in the present. Gabriel sat across from her, giving her space. He didn't press her with questions, didn't flood her with advice. He simply watched with quiet strength, as though he knew what she needed most was silence. For the first hour of the flight, Emma wept softly. Not the loud, broken sobs of the hallway, but a quiet release, tears that washed months of humiliation from her heart. Each tear carried the weight of Adrian's betrayals. Each breath drew her further away from the life she had clung to out of habit, fear, and misplaced love. When the tears finally stopped, she leaned back, exhausted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt lighter. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Gabriel's voice broke the stillness. Emma turned her head, her eyes still red. "What?" "A woman who stood up when the world expected her to bow." Her lips trembled into the ghost of a smile. "I don't feel strong. I feel empty." Gabriel leaned forward, his voice gentle but steady. "That emptiness? It's space. Space for something new. You've carried the weight of his lies for too long. Now you get to choose what fills you." The words lingered, a seed planting itself in her soul. By the time the jet touched down hours later in a quiet coastal city far from the tabloids' reach, Emma felt something she hadn't in months: possibility. Gabriel led her into a secluded villa overlooking the sea. The air was crisp with salt, the waves crashing against the cliffs below. The villa itself was simple, elegant, not a monument to wealth like Adrian's penthouse, but a sanctuary. Warm lights glowed from inside, casting a golden welcome. "This place is yours for as long as you need," Gabriel said as he carried her small suitcase inside. Emma stood at the threshold, her hands still on her belly. For so long, home had been a prison, filled with suspicion and fear. Now, for the first time, she stepped into a space that felt safe. The days that followed were quiet, healing, transformative. Each morning, Emma walked along the shoreline, her feet sinking into the sand, her hair tangling in the salty breeze. She whispered to her baby, telling him stories of seashells and sunlight instead of betrayal and pain. Each word was a promise that his life would begin in hope, not shame. Afternoons were spent sketching again. Gabriel had surprised her with a set of pencils and a large sketchbook, placed gently on the kitchen table one morning without a word. Emma's fingers had hesitated at first, clumsy from disuse, but soon the lines flowed again. Curves of houses, windows filled with light, structures that breathed warmth and safety. She was rediscovering the woman she had been before Adrian's shadow swallowed her. One evening, as the sunset painted the ocean in fire and gold, Gabriel found her on the porch, sketchbook in her lap. "You're glowing," he said simply. Emma laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm 6 months pregnant and wearing the same dress 3 days in a row." "Glowing," he repeated, his gaze steady, his tone leaving no room for doubt. She felt her cheeks warm. For years she had been invisible in her own marriage. Now, under Gabriel's quiet watch, she was seen again. Not as a wife defined by her husband, but as herself. Still, transformation wasn't only about healing. It was also about facing the world again. And Emma knew she couldn't hide forever. The call came one morning, her lawyer telling her that Adrian's empire was crumbling, his assets frozen, his investors abandoning ship. And Sienna? Headlines plastered her face with words like gold digger, traitor, fallen star. The same society that had applauded her at the gala now devoured her downfall with glee. Emma listened quietly, her hand stroking her belly. A part of her felt satisfaction, yes, but another part felt something unexpected. Pity. Sienna had been cruel, but she too was now broken by Adrian's lies. After the call, Emma stared at herself in the mirror. Her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes clearer, her posture straighter. She saw a woman no longer defined by betrayal, but by survival. "I'm not broken," she whispered to her reflection. "I'm becoming." That evening, she asked Gabriel for help. "I need to face the world again," she said. "Not as his wife, not as his victim, but as me." Gabriel nodded, his eyes soft but proud. "Then let's show them who you are." The next days were a blur of preparation. Gabriel arranged for a stylist, not to cover her pain, but to highlight her strength. Emma chose clothing that made her feel powerful, yet authentic, simple, elegant, timeless. No sequins to compete, no flash to distract, just her. She began practicing speaking again, telling her story out loud, not as confession but as declaration. Gabriel listened patiently, offering feedback only when asked. He didn't tell her what to say, he simply reminded her of who she was. And when the day came for her first public appearance since the scandal, Emma stood tall. No trembling, no shame, she walked out of the villa dressed in white, a symbol of clarity, of new beginnings. As cameras flashed, she held her head high, her hand resting over her belly. No longer the broken wife, no longer the silent victim. She was Emma Lawson, reborn. The transformation was not about revenge, it was about reclamation. Reclaiming her dignity, reclaiming her future, reclaiming her voice. And as Gabriel walked quietly beside her, not as her savior but as her equal, Emma felt the truth settle in her bones. She hadn't just survived Adrian's betrayal. She had transformed it into the beginning of her new life. And this time she would not bow. She would rise. The morning air outside the courthouse was electric with tension. Reporters swarmed the steps, their cameras flashing like relentless lightning. Microphones bristled in the crowd, each one eager to catch a soundbite, a quote, a scandalous detail. Adrian Lawson's trial had become the circus of the year. But the story was no longer just about Adrian. It was about Emma Lawson, the pregnant wife who had stood silent through his betrayals, the woman the tabloids once painted as weak, pitiful, forgotten. Today she was stepping into the light, no longer as a victim, but as a force. The sleek black car pulled up to the curb. For a moment, the crowd held its breath. Then the door opened. Emma emerged. She wore a simple white dress, elegant and understated, flowing gracefully over her growing belly. A tailored coat draped her shoulders, and a delicate chain rested at her collarbone. No sequins, no diamonds, just strength woven into every detail of her presence. Her hair fell in soft waves, her face calm, her eyes clear. The cameras went wild. Flash after flash illuminated her as she walked up the steps, one hand on her stomach, the other brushing lightly against the railing. Gabriel Stone walked beside her, tall, steady, his quiet presence like a shield against the storm. The sight of them together sent a ripple through the crowd. Whispers ignited like sparks. Is that him? The billionaire investor? They say he sent the jet for her. Emma ignored the noise. Each step she took was deliberate, unhurried, regal. For so long she had walked with her head bowed. Today her chin was lifted, her shoulders back. The world would not see weakness in her again. Inside the courthouse, Adrian was already waiting. He sat at the defense table, shackled not by handcuffs this time, but by his own disgrace. His once perfect suit hung loose, wrinkled. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. The arrogance that had once fueled him was gone, replaced by a gnawing desperation. And beside him, like a shadow stripped of light, sat Sienna Cruz. Gone was the fiery mistress draped in ruby silk. Today she wore a plain black dress, her makeup smeared from tears, her expression hollow. She had been abandoned by the society that once worshipped her beauty. The headlines had been merciless: Mistress falls with mogul. From red carpet to courtroom shame. The woman who once mocked Emma now sat shrunken, broken, her hand twitching nervously in her lap. When Adrian saw Emma enter, his jaw clenched. He leaned forward, whispering frantically to his lawyer. His eyes darted between Emma and Gabriel, fury burning in them. He recognized the man, of course. Gabriel had once been the friend he dismissed, the rival he never took seriously. And now, here he was, standing proudly at Emma's side, where Adrian himself no longer belonged. Emma didn't look at him. Not once. She walked past the defense table without a flicker of acknowledgement, as though Adrian were nothing more than a stranger. That disregard cut deeper than anger ever could. The trial itself was a blur of legal jargon, evidence presented, witnesses testifying. But the highlight, the moment the world would never forget, came during a break when Emma stepped outside to address the press. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrust into her face. "Mrs. Lawson, how do you feel about your husband's charges? Do you regret exposing him?" "What will you do now?" Emma lifted her hand, and the crowd fell silent. Her voice, when it came, was steady, resonant, carrying the weight of truth. "I stood by a man who betrayed me, who betrayed all of us. For years I stayed silent, believing it was strength. But silence is not strength. It is surrender. Tonight, I stand here not as his wife, not as his victim, but as a woman who chose dignity over lies. To every woman who has been humiliated, who has been told to endure in silence, I say, you are stronger than you know, and you deserve better." The crowd erupted. Applause, shouts of support, tears streaming down faces in the audience. Emma's words spread like wildfire, replayed on every news channel, shared across every social feed. Overnight, she became more than a betrayed wife. She became a symbol. Inside the courthouse, Adrian seethed. His fists clenched, his teeth ground together. The sight of Emma commanding the world's respect while he rotted in disgrace was unbearable. He tried to shout as reporters replayed her words in the courtroom, but the judge silenced him with a stern gavel. His downfall was complete, and it was Emma who had delivered the final blow. Sienna, too, faced her reckoning. When she left the courthouse, the crowd turned on her. Cameras flashed, but this time with venom, not admiration. Reporters shouted, "Did you think he'd leave his wife for you? Was it worth it? How does it feel to lose everything?" She tried to push through, but the voices followed her, each one a dagger. She had mocked Emma once, but now she was the spectacle of shame. And Emma? She walked out again with Gabriel at her side, the cameras capturing not scandal, but triumph. That night, headlines shifted. No longer was the story just mogul arrested for fraud. Now it was, pregnant wife reclaims dignity, becomes voice for women everywhere. Emma sat in the villa later, watching the coverage. She placed her hand on her belly and whispered, "We did it." She thought of the broken girl who had once begged Adrian for scraps of love, and she realized she would never be that woman again. She was free. She was respected. She was whole. And as Gabriel brought her a cup of tea, their eyes met. No words were needed. Their bond, once hidden in the shadows of youth, was now unfolding in the light. Because revenge had never been about destroying Adrian, it was about reclaiming herself. And in doing so, Emma Lawson had written an ending the world would never forget. The trial ended as everyone knew it would. Adrian Lawson, once a titan of finance, was sentenced to years in prison. His empire crumbled, his name dragged through the mud he himself had created. The courtroom buzzed with the finality of it, but for Emma, the verdict was not a celebration. It was a release. A door closing, so another could finally open. Sienna Cruz slipped away from the courthouse that day with sunglasses hiding her swollen eyes. The headlines had already branded her a cautionary tale, from mistress to outcast. Invitations stopped arriving. Endorsement deals evaporated. The same society that had once embraced her now spat her name with contempt. She became a ghost in the very world she had tried to conquer. That was her punishment, not prison bars, but exile from the glitter she had craved. For Emma, the punishment wasn't about them anymore. It was about reclaiming herself. Weeks later, she walked along the shoreline outside the coastal villa, the waves crashing against the rocks, the air fresh with salt and promise. Her belly was rounder now, her baby's kicks stronger. Each movement reminded her of why she had fought, why she had chosen truth over silence. Gabriel joined her, his steps steady in the sand. He carried 2 mugs of tea, handing one to her. They stood in silence for a while, watching the horizon bleed gold as the sun set. Emma finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Do you ever wonder why life brings people back to us when we least expect it?" Gabriel smiled faintly. "I don't think it's chance. I think some bonds never really break. They just wait for the right time." She looked at him, her heart catching. "I thought I'd lost everything, and then you appeared." "You didn't lose everything, Emma," Gabriel said. "You found yourself again. That's worth more than anything." Her eyes welled with quiet tears. But these weren't the tears of sorrow that had once drowned her. These were tears of gratitude, of healing. In the weeks that followed, Emma's transformation continued. She accepted interviews, not as scandal fodder, but as a voice of strength. She spoke to women's groups, sharing her story not as tragedy, but as empowerment. She reminded them that silence was not strength, that endurance was not love, that dignity mattered more than appearances. Her words resonated. She became a symbol of resilience, her face gracing magazines not as the betrayed wife, but as the woman who rose. Gabriel remained by her side through it all. Not in the spotlight, not seeking recognition, just steady, patient, quietly building a future that included her if she wanted it, and Emma did want it. One evening, months later, she went into labor. The villa filled with the sounds of hurried footsteps, gentle reassurances, and Emma's cries of effort. Gabriel never left her side, holding her hand, whispering, "You're stronger than you know." Hours later, she cradled her newborn son in her arms, his tiny fingers curled around hers, his breath soft and steady. Emma wept, overwhelmed by love so pure it erased every shadow of the past. Gabriel watched from her side, his eyes misting. "He's perfect." Emma looked at him, her voice trembling. "He's not yours, Gabriel, but—" Gabriel placed a finger gently on her lips. "He's yours. That's enough for me." Her heart swelled. In that moment, she knew. Love wasn't about possession or perfection. It was about presence. About choosing to stay when others walked away. Weeks later, Emma returned to the city, not to hide in shame, but to stand tall. She walked into a gala, not as Adrian's wife, not as his shadow, but as herself. The crowd hushed when she entered, whispers rippling like wind through glass. She wore white again, her son nestled safely in Gabriel's arms, her posture regal, her eyes unshaken. This time, no one mocked. No one whispered, "Poor Emma." They whispered something else. Resilient, stronger than ever, unbreakable. Emma stood before the cameras, her son close, Gabriel steady by her side, and she spoke words that would echo for years. "Pain doesn't define us. Betrayal doesn't end us. It tests us. And if we choose dignity, if we choose truth, if we choose ourselves, we rise, always." The crowd erupted, applause thundered, not for scandal but for strength. Adrian rotted behind bars. Sienna faded into obscurity. But Emma, she lived, she thrived, she loved again. And on quiet nights when the world outside slept, she sat with Gabriel by the fire, their son in her arms. She would smile softly and whisper, "We're finally free." Because freedom wasn't just leaving Adrian. It wasn't just surviving betrayal. Freedom was choosing herself. Freedom was opening her heart again to love that was steady, kind, and true. Emma Lawson's story didn't end with scandal. It began with it. And from those ashes, she rose, not as a victim, but as a woman who reclaimed her dignity, her life, and her future. So, that's where the story closes, my wonderful friends. You're still here with me, aren't you? If you've stayed until now, it means something in Emma's journey has touched your heart in its own quiet way. And maybe that's because her story is really our story too. About pain, betrayal, but also about rising again. The Stoics said, "We cannot control what happens to us, only how we respond." And isn't that what Emma showed us? She couldn't stop Adrian from betraying her, but she chose dignity over silence, truth over fear. She learned that pain doesn't define us, our response does. Seneca once wrote, "Sometimes even to live is an act of courage." Emma's courage to walk away, to start anew, is proof that healing is always possible. So if you're carrying your own scars tonight, remember, you are stronger than you know. Like Emma, you can reclaim your dignity, your peace, and your future. If this story has moved you, give it a like, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to our channel. Because here together, we'll keep reminding each other, no matter the betrayal, no matter the pain, you can rise. Always.